John was a simple man with a straightforward life. He lived in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other by name. His days were filled with fixing cars at the local garage, chatting with customers about their vehicles, and occasionally sharing stories over coffee during his lunch break. John wasn't rich, but he didn't need to be. He had a roof over his head, food on the table, and people who cared about him. Life was good, or so he thought, until one fateful Saturday afternoon changed everything. It was an ordinary day just like any other. The sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays across the town's streets. John had spent most of his morning running errands, picking up groceries, dropping off some paperwork at the post office, and grabbing a few parts for the garage. By early afternoon, he decided it was time to head home. As he climbed into his old but reliable truck, he felt content, thinking about how nice it would be to relax for the rest of the day. The drive back was uneventful at first. The roads were quiet, save for the occasional car passing by. John hummed, along to the radio, tapping his fingers lightly on the steering wheel as he approached a four-way intersection. There was no traffic in sight, but out of habit he slowed down anyway, coming to a complete stop at the sign. It was something his father had drilled into him when he was learning to drive. Always follow the rules. You never know what could happen. Just as he was about to pull forward, John noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. Confusion washed over him. Had he done something wrong? He hadn't been speeding, hadn't run the stop sign, and certainly hadn't broken any laws that he was aware of. Still, he signaled and pulled over to the side of the road, parking carefully. His heart began to race, not out of guilt, but out of uncertainty. What could this possibly be about? When the officer stepped out of the patrol car, John immediately recognized him. Officer Grayson. If there was one person in town whose reputation preceded him, it was Grayson. Tall, broad-shouldered, and always wearing mirrored sunglasses that made it impossible to read his expression, Grayson carried himself with an air of superiority that put people on edge. He wasn't exactly beloved by the community. Stories about his short temper and aggressive behavior had circulated for years, though nothing had ever been proven. Most folks preferred to keep their heads down and avoid crossing paths with him if they could help it. Grayson strode toward John's truck, with long, purposeful strides, his boots thudding heavily against the pavement. Even before he reached the window, John could feel the tension radiating off him. Rolling down the window, John greeted him politely, trying to stay calm despite the knot forming in his stomach. "Good afternoon, officer," he said, his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" Instead of responding, Grayson leaned down, peering into the truck with narrowed eyes. His mirrored sunglasses reflected John's face, making it hard to tell where he was looking. "License and registration," Grayson barked, his tone sharp and accusatory. John blinked, caught off guard by the hostility in the officer's voice. "Sure thing," he replied quickly, reaching for his wallet and the glove compartment where he kept his vehicle documents. But before he could even finish the motion, Grayson interrupted him. "What do you think you're doing?" Grayson snapped, his voice rising. "You trying to hide something? Move slowly." John froze, his hands hovering mid-air. "I'm not hiding anything, sir," he explained, keeping his tone respectful despite the growing unease bubbling inside. "Ahem. I'm just getting my license and registration like you asked." But Grayson wasn't listening, or maybe he didn't care. Without warning, he reached for the holster strapped to his hip and drew his gun, pointing it directly at John's head. The world seemed to stop spinning in that moment. Time slowed down as John stared wide-eyed at the barrel of the weapon, his mind struggling to process what was happening. His breath hitched in his throat, and his palms grew clammy against the steering wheel. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Grayson shouted, his finger resting dangerously close to the trigger. "Don't move unless I tell you to." John did as he was told, raising his hands slightly to show he meant no harm. His heart pounded wildly in his chest, threatening to burst through his rib cage. Fear gripped him like a vice, but beneath it lay a simmering anger. This wasn't right. He hadn't done anything wrong. Why was this happening? Why was Grayson treating him like a criminal? For several agonizing minutes, Grayson continued to bark orders, demanding answers to questions John didn't understand. "Why were you driving so recklessly?" he demanded, though John had been obeying every rule of the road. "What are you hiding in that truck?" "I wasn't driving recklessly," John stammered, his voice trembling despite his best efforts to remain composed. "And there's nothing in my truck, I swear, officer, I haven't done anything wrong." Grayson scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "Don't lie to me," he snarled, pressing the gun closer. "People like you always have something to hide." The phrase, "people like you," struck a nerve. John didn't consider himself extraordinary. He was just a regular guy trying to live his life. But hearing those words from Grayson felt like an insult. Was this really how the officer saw him? Not as John, the mechanic who fixed cars and paid his taxes, but as some faceless stereotype. The realization stung more than the fear gripping his chest. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, Grayson lowered his weapon and stepped back, though he kept his hand firmly on the grip of his gun. "Get out of the truck," he ordered, gruffly. "Now!" John complied, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid provoking the volatile officer further. Once outside, he stood beside his truck, hands raised in surrender while Grayson circled him like a predator sizing up its prey. The officer patted him down roughly, searching for weapons or contraband that weren't there. When he found nothing, he turned his attention to the truck itself, rifling through its contents with little regard for John's belongings. Throughout the ordeal, John remained silent, biting back the frustration and indignation boiling inside him. He knew better than to argue with someone holding all the power and a loaded gun. But deep down he vowed to himself that this wouldn't be the end of it. Something had to change. Someone had to hold Grayson accountable for his actions. And if no one else was willing to step up, then maybe it would have to be him. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon as John finally drove away from the side of the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. His truck felt foreign now, tainted by the memory of what had just transpired. The encounter with Officer Grayson replayed in his mind like a broken record, each moment sharper and more unsettling than the last. He couldn't shake the image of the gun pointed at his head, or the biting tone of Grayson's voice accusing him of things he hadn't done. What was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday afternoon had turned into something far darker. When John arrived home, he parked his truck in the driveway and sat there for a long time, staring blankly at the dashboard. His wife, Sarah, noticed him sitting motionless through the kitchen window. Concerned, she stepped outside, wrapping her sweater around herself against the evening chill. "John?" she called softly, approaching the driver's side door. "Is everything okay?" At first, John didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to put into words what had happened. How could he explain the fear that had gripped him, the anger that still simmered beneath the surface? Finally, he took a deep breath and began recounting the story, starting with the unexpected traffic stop and ending with Grayson's aggressive behavior. As he spoke, Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, then to outrage. "That's unbelievable," she said, shaking her head. "He can't treat people like that. You didn't do anything wrong." "I know," John replied, his voice heavy with frustration. "But what am I supposed to do about it? It's his word against mine. Everyone knows how he is, but no one ever says anything." Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Maybe it's time someone did," she suggested gently. "If you don't say something, who will?" Her words lingered in John's mind long after their conversation ended. That night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he wrestled with the idea of speaking out. On one hand, he knew Sarah was right. Grayson's behavior couldn't go unchecked. But on the other hand, the thought of confronting someone with so much authority terrified him. Would anyone even believe him? And if they did, what would happen next? Could he really take on someone like Grayson? The next morning, John decided to talk to a few trusted friends about what had happened. He started with Mark, a fellow mechanic, at the garage. Over coffee during their break, John recounted the incident in detail. Mark listened intently, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing moment. When John finished, Mark let out a low whistle. "Wow, that's intense," he said, shaking his head. "Honestly, I'm not surprised. There have been rumors about Grayson for years. People have talked about similar run-ins, but Nothing ever comes of it. Folks are too scared to speak up. John nodded grimly. That's exactly what I'm worried about. If everyone stays quiet, nothing changes, but if I come forward, I feel like I'm putting myself in the line of fire. Mark hesitated, clearly torn between supporting his friend and cautioning him against potential consequences. I get where you're coming from, he admitted. But maybe this is your chance to make a difference. If enough people stand with you, it might actually lead to something. Encouraged by Mark's words, John spent the rest of the week reaching out to others in the community. Some were hesitant to share their stories, fearing retaliation or simply wanting to avoid drama. But slowly, cracks began to form in the wall of silence. A neighbor mentioned seeing Grayson berate another driver at a gas station. An old friend recalled being pulled over under suspicious circumstances years ago. Each story added weight to John's growing conviction that he wasn't alone, and neither were the others who had suffered at Grayson's hands. One particularly impactful conversation came from Lisa, a young woman who worked at the local bakery. She approached John one afternoon while he was picking up bread for dinner. Her voice was soft but steady as she told him about her own experience with Grayson. It happened a few months ago, she explained, glancing around nervously before continuing. I was driving home late at night when he pulled me over. I hadn't done anything wrong, I swear. But when I asked why he stopped me, he got really defensive. He yelled at me, accused me of lying, and made me sit on the curb for almost an hour while he searched my car. By the time he let me go, I was shaking so badly I could barely drive. John listened intently, his heart breaking for her. Did you report it? He asked. Lisa shook her head. No. My mom told me not to bother. She said no one would listen, and it would only make things worse. But hearing about what happened to you, maybe we should have spoken up sooner. By the end of the week, John realized he had stumbled upon something bigger than himself. This wasn't just about him and Grayson. It was about a pattern of behavior that had gone unchecked for far too long. With Sarah's encouragement, he decided to file a formal complaint with the police department. It wasn't an easy decision. The process was daunting, and the possibility of backlash loomed large. But John reminded himself why he was doing this. Not just for himself, but for Lisa, Mark, and all the others who had been silenced by fear. As word spread about John's actions, the community began to stir. Conversations that had once been whispered behind closed doors were now happening more openly. People shared their frustrations on social media, tagging local news outlets and urging them to investigate. One reporter, intrigued by the growing buzz, reached out to John for an interview. Though nervous, John agreed, knowing it was an opportunity to shine a light on the issue. The interview aired on the local news channel that weekend, capturing the attention of viewers across the town. John spoke calmly but firmly, recounting his experience without exaggeration or hostility. He emphasized that his goal wasn't revenge but accountability. This isn't about targeting one person, he said. It's about making sure our community is safe for everyone. The response was overwhelming. Calls poured into the police department from concerned citizens demanding answers. Others took to social media to share their own experiences, tagging hashtags like "Want Justice for John" and "Want Hold Them Accountable." For the first time in years, the community found its voice, united by a shared desire for change. Meanwhile, Grayson remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. Confident in his position of power, he continued going about his duties as usual, seemingly unaware of the growing chorus of complaints directed at him. Friends and colleagues who had once laughed off his antics began distancing themselves, sensing the tide was turning. Even within the police department, whispers of unease grew louder. Higher-ups, eager to protect the department's reputation, scrambled to address the situation before it spiraled further out of control. For John, watching, the momentum build was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking. He knew the fight was far from over. Filing a complaint and speaking to the media were just the first steps. The real challenge would come when the authorities decided whether to take action. Still, he felt a flicker of hope. A belief that maybe, just maybe, standing up to injustice could spark meaningful change. As the days passed, John couldn't help but reflect on how quickly his life had changed. What had started as a routine errand had transformed into a crusade for justice. He didn't ask for this role, but he embraced it nonetheless, driven by the knowledge that staying silent would only perpetuate the cycle of abuse. Whether the outcome would bring closure or further conflict remained uncertain, but one thing was clear. John had ignited a movement that showed no signs of slowing down. The days following John's decision to file a formal complaint felt like a whirlwind. At first, it seemed as though nothing was happening. The police department acknowledged receipt of his complaint, but offered little else in terms of updates. For John, the silence was deafening. He couldn't help but wonder if his voice had fallen on deaf ears, swallowed up by the same system that had allowed Grayson to act with impunity for so long. But beneath the surface, something was stirring. Something bigger than anyone could have anticipated. As news of John's complaint spread, more people began coming forward. Some contacted the police department directly, while others reached out to local reporters or posted their stories online. One by one, they shared accounts eerily similar to John's: unnecessary traffic stops, verbal intimidation, and even physical threats. A pattern emerged, painting a disturbing picture of an officer who operated not as a protector of the community, but as its bully. One particularly compelling story came from a man named David, a retired schoolteacher who lived on the outskirts of town. David recounted how Grayson had pulled him over late one evening, claiming he'd been speeding, a claim David vehemently denied. When David questioned the validity of the stop, Grayson grew aggressive, slamming his hand on the roof of the car and shouting obscenities. "He made me feel like I was worthless," David told a reporter during an emotional interview. "Like my word didn't matter because he had a badge." Another victim, Maria, described being detained for nearly 2 hours after Grayson accused her of having stolen property in her trunk. Despite producing receipts and proof of ownership, she was forced to sit on the curb in the cold while Grayson ransacked her belongings. "I kept asking why he was doing this," Maria said, tears streaming down her face. "But he wouldn't answer me. He just kept saying I was lying." Each new account added fuel to the fire, turning what had started as a single complaint into a full-blown investigation. Local media outlets picked up the story, running headlines like "Is our town safe?" and calls for accountability grow louder. Social media buzzed with hashtags, petitions, and calls to action. Residents gathered outside City Hall, holding signs that read "Justice over abuse" and "Enough is enough." The movement had officially taken root, and there was no turning back. Inside the police department, tensions were mounting. Higher-ups scrambled to contain the growing backlash, aware that public trust in law enforcement was hanging by a thread. Internal Affairs launched a formal inquiry into Grayson's conduct, combing through years' worth of records, body camera, footage, and witness statements. What they found was damning. Reports of excessive force, falsified documentation, and blatant disregard for protocol piled up, revealing a pattern of misconduct that stretched back far longer than anyone had imagined. Grayson, however, remained defiant. When investigators called him in for questioning, he dismissed the allegations as baseless accusations fueled by angry citizens looking for attention. He insisted that every action he'd taken had been justified, citing vague claims of suspicious behavior and potential threats. His arrogance was palpable, bordering on reckless. To those who knew him well, or thought they did, it was clear he believed himself untouchable, shielded by his badge and the authority it represented. But the evidence told a different story. Investigators uncovered several instances where Grayson had fabricated details in his reports to justify unwarranted searches or arrests. In one case, he claimed a driver had resisted arrest when video footage clearly showed the individual complying with his commands. In another, he listed non-existent contraband as the reason for detaining a young woman, only to release her hours later without explanation. These revelations painted a chilling portrait of an officer who viewed the law not as a guide, but as a tool to wield however he pleased. Meanwhile, the pressure on the police department continued to mount. Community leaders demanded transparency, calling for regular updates on the status of the investigation. Local politicians weighed in, some offering support for reform efforts while others attempted to downplay the severity of the situation. Protesters marched through the streets, chanting slogans and demanding accountability. Even businesses joined the conversation, with several shop owners displaying signs in their windows, showing solidarity with the victims. For John, watching the community rally around the cause filled him with a mix of pride and unease. On one hand, he was grateful for the outpouring of support. It reassured him that he wasn't alone in this fight, that others saw the injustice and were willing to stand against it. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the fear that things might escalate further before they got better. What if Grayson retaliated? What if the department tried to sweep everything under the rug again? Despite these concerns, John refused to back down. He attended town hall meetings, spoke at rallies, and met with advocates pushing for systemic change within law enforcement. His courage inspired others to join the movement, transforming what had once been a quiet town into a hub of activism. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other before now stood side by side, united by a shared goal, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what they had. As weeks turned into months, the investigation dragged on, testing everyone's patience. Grayson's supporters dwindled, leaving him increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had once laughed off his antics now avoided him altogether, unwilling to be associated with someone whose reputation had become toxic. Friends stopped inviting him to gatherings, and family members distanced themselves, unsure of how to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the man portrayed in the media. Finally, after months of painstaking work, Internal Affairs released their findings. The report was exhaustive, detailing numerous violations of policy and procedure committed by Grayson over the course of his career. Among the most egregious offenses were the use of excessive force, falsification of official documents, and repeated instances of unprofessional conduct. The conclusion was unequivocal. Grayson had abused his position of power and betrayed the trust placed in him by the community. The fallout was swift and severe. Grayson was suspended without pay, pending further disciplinary action, and criminal charges were filed against him for misconduct and civil rights violations. News of his suspension sent shockwaves through the town, sparking both relief and disbelief. Many celebrated the development as a victory for justice, while others expressed skepticism, wondering whether the punishment would truly fit the crime. For John, the news brought a sense of vindication, but also a sobering reminder of how much work remained to be done. While Grayson's removal from the force was a step in the right direction, it wasn't enough to undo the damage he had caused. Too many lives had been disrupted, too many families traumatized. True accountability required more than just punishing one bad actor. It demanded systemic changes to prevent such abuses from happening again. In the weeks that followed, the community came together to push for sweeping reforms. Advocacy groups drafted proposals calling for increased oversight, mandatory de-escalation, training, and stricter consequences for officers found guilty of misconduct. Lawmakers listened, introducing legislation aimed at addressing the issues raised by the Grayson scandal. Slowly but surely, progress began to take shape. Through it, John remained at the forefront of the movement, using his experience to advocate for change. He often reflected on how far they had come since that fateful day by the side of the road. What had started as a personal ordeal had blossomed into a collective effort to create a safer, fairer community. And though challenges still lay ahead, John took comfort in knowing that he and countless others had found the courage to speak out against injustice. The months following Grayson's suspension were a whirlwind of legal battles, public hearings, and community activism. The town had never seen anything like it before. What started as a single complaint from John had snowballed into a full-blown movement, with people demanding not just accountability for Grayson but also sweeping reforms to ensure such abuses of power would never happen again. For John, the journey was both exhausting and empowering. He found himself at the center of it all, speaking at rallies, meeting with lawmakers, and even testifying in court when Grayson's case finally went to trial. The courtroom was packed. On the first day of the trial, reporters jostled for seats in the gallery, cameras flashing as Grayson walked in flanked by his attorney. Dressed in a suit that seemed too formal for the man who had once strutted around town in his uniform, Grayson looked different now. Gone was the arrogance that had defined him for so long. Instead, he appeared tense, almost fragile, as though he could sense the walls closing in. John sat a few rows behind him, surrounded by other victims who had come forward. They exchanged nervous glances, their hands gripping folders filled with evidence they had gathered over the past year. As the prosecution laid out its case, the weight of Grayson's actions became undeniable. Witness after witness took the stand, recounting harrowing stories of intimidation, threats, and unwarranted violence. Lisa, the young woman from the bakery, broke down in tears as she described how Grayson's behavior had left her too afraid to drive alone at night for months afterward. David, the retired schoolteacher, recounted how being humiliated during a traffic stop had shattered his faith in the justice system. Each testimony added another layer to the portrait of an officer who had abused his power repeatedly and without remorse. John was called to testify midway through the trial. As he took the stand, the room fell silent. All eyes were on him, but he focused only on the prosecutor, determined to stay calm and composed. When asked to describe the events of that fateful Saturday afternoon, John spoke slowly and clearly, painting a vivid picture of the fear and helplessness he had felt when Grayson pointed a gun at his head. "I didn't know what was going to happen," he said, his voice steady despite the emotions swirling inside him. "All I knew was that I hadn't done anything wrong, and yet here was someone with a badge and a weapon telling me I was guilty." His words resonated deeply with those in the courtroom. Even some of Grayson's former colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, unable to meet John's gaze. The defense tried to poke holes in his account, suggesting that John might have misunderstood the situation or exaggerated certain details, but John held firm, refusing to let them twist his story. By the time he stepped down from the stand, there was a palpable shift in the air. The tide was turning against Grayson. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere was electric. Protesters gathered daily, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding justice. Local businesses displayed banners in their windows showing solidarity with the victims. Social media buzzed with updates about the trial, hashtags trending nationwide as people followed the story closely. For many, this wasn't just about one rogue officer. It was about holding institutions accountable and ensuring that no one else would suffer the way John and others had. After weeks of testimonies and deliberations, the jury finally reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed once again, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. When the foreperson stood to deliver the decision, every eye turned toward them. "We find the defendant guilty on all counts," they announced, their voice ringing out across the room. A wave of relief washed over John as he exhaled sharply. It was over. Grayson had been convicted of misconduct, abuse of power, and multiple civil rights violations. The judge sentenced him to several years in prison and ordered him to pay hefty fines to the victims whose lives he had disrupted. As Grayson was led away in handcuffs, John couldn't help but feel a mix of emotions: satisfaction, vindication, and sadness. This victory came at a cost, not just for him but for everyone who had endured Grayson's cruelty. But the fight didn't end there. In the wake of the trial, the community pushed harder than ever for systemic change. Lawmakers introduced new legislation aimed at increasing transparency within law enforcement agencies. Mandatory training programs on de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity were implemented for officers. Independent oversight boards were established to review complaints against police conduct. These measures weren't perfect, but they marked a significant step forward, a promise that the mistakes of the past wouldn't be repeated. For Grayson, life behind bars proved to be a harsh reality check. Stripped of his badge, his authority, and his freedom, he struggled to adapt to his new circumstances. Fellow inmates treated him with disdain, viewing him as a symbol of everything wrong with law enforcement. His family visited sporadically at first, but as time went on, those visits became fewer and farther between. Financially, Grayson was ruined. Legal fees and court-ordered damages wiped out his savings, leaving him with nothing. The man who had once strutted through town as if he owned it was now a shadow of his former self, isolated and disgraced. Meanwhile, John continued to advocate for reform, using his platform to amplify the voices of others. He traveled to neighboring towns, sharing his story and urging communities to hold their leaders accountable. At home, he worked closely with local organizations to implement the changes needed to rebuild trust between residents and law enforcement. Though the scars of his ordeal remained, John found solace in knowing that his courage had sparked meaningful change. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset, Sarah joined him, handing him a cup of coffee. "You've done so much. Good," she said softly, sitting beside him. "Do you think it was worth it?" John took a sip of his coffee, gazing out at the horizon. "It's hard to say," he admitted. "There were times when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if speaking up would make any difference at all. But seeing how far we've come, yeah, I think it was worth it." Sarah smiled, leaning her head against his shoulder. "You've inspired so many people, John, not just here but everywhere. That's something to be proud of." As the sky darkened and the stars began to appear, John felt a sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead wouldn't always be easy, but he knew the community was stronger now, more united, more resilient. Together they had faced down injustice and emerged victorious. And while Grayson's downfall served as a cautionary tale, it was also a reminder that no one, regardless of their position or power, was above the law. The months that followed the trial marked a turning point for the town. The once silent community had transformed into a beacon of resilience and unity, proving that collective action could bring about real change. For John, life began to settle into a new rhythm, though the echoes of his ordeal lingered. He often found himself reflecting on how much had changed, not just in his own life but in the lives of those around him. What had started as a personal fight against injustice had grown into something far greater, a movement to create a safer, fairer world for everyone. One of the most profound changes was the shift in the relationship between the community and law enforcement. In the past, there had been an invisible wall separating residents from officers, a sense of mistrust that made cooperation difficult. But after Grayson's conviction, the police department made genuine efforts to rebuild that trust. New leadership took charge, implementing policies designed to foster transparency and accountability. Officers were required to wear body cameras at all times, and footage was regularly reviewed by independent oversight committees. Community meetings became more frequent, giving residents a platform to voice their concerns directly to law enforcement officials. John played a key role in these initiatives, often serving as a liaison between the public and the department. His experiences gave him unique insight into the challenges faced by both sides, allowing him to bridge gaps that had long seemed insurmountable. At one meeting, he stood before a room full of people, some skeptical, others hopeful, and shared his vision for the future. "We're not here to point fingers or assign blame," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're here because we want to make things better, for everyone. That means working together, listening to each other, and holding ourselves accountable." His words resonated deeply with those in attendance. Slowly but surely, attitudes began to shift. Residents who had once avoided contact with police now approached them with questions and suggestions. Officers, too, became more open to feedback, recognizing that building trust was a two-way street. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension and misunderstanding, but progress was undeniable. For Grayson, however, life remained bleak. Serving his sentence in a medium-security prison, he struggled to adapt to his new reality. Gone were the days when he could command respect or fear with nothing more than a badge and a glare. Now he was just another inmate, subject to the same rules and routines as everyone else. Fellow prisoners treated him with disdain, viewing him as a traitor to their ranks. Even guards kept their distance, wary of associating too closely with someone whose reputation preceded him. Financially, Grayson was ruined. The court-ordered damages had wiped out what little savings he had left, forcing him to rely on family members for support. But even they grew weary of his constant complaints and excuses. Visits became less frequent, letters went unanswered, and eventually, Grayson found himself utterly alone. The isolation weighed heavily on him, stripping away the last remnants of his arrogance. By the time he was released years later, he was a shadow of the man he used to be, a broken figure haunted by the consequences of his actions. Back in the town, life moved forward. The reforms sparked by John's activism continued to take root, shaping a brighter future for generations to come. Schools began incorporating lessons on civic responsibility and ethical leadership into their curriculums, teaching children the importance of standing up for what's right. Local businesses partnered with advocacy groups to sponsor workshops and events aimed at fostering dialogue between residents and law enforcement. Even neighboring towns took notice, adopting similar measures to address issues within their own communities. John, meanwhile, emerged as a local hero. Though he never sought recognition, people couldn't help but admire his courage and determination. Strangers stopped him on the street to thank him for speaking out. Parents told their kids stories about how one man's bravery had inspired an entire town to demand justice. And while John appreciated the praise, he always redirected the focus back to the community. "This wasn't just me," he'd say, humbly. "It was all of us. If people hadn't come forward, if they hadn't supported each other, none of this would have happened." Despite the accolades, John remained grounded. He returned to his job at the garage, finding comfort in the familiarity of fixing cars and chatting with customers. Yet he also embraced his role as an advocate, traveling to conferences and speaking engagements across the country. His story resonated with audiences far beyond his hometown, inspiring others to confront injustices in their own lives. Whether addressing a packed auditorium or sitting down for a quiet conversation over coffee, John spoke with the same sincerity and conviction that had fueled his journey from the beginning. As time passed, the scars of his ordeal began to fade, but not entirely. There were still nights when John woke up in a cold sweat, reliving the moment Grayson pointed a gun at his head. Those memories stayed with him, a reminder of the fragility of safety and the importance of vigilance. But alongside the pain came pride, an enduring sense of accomplishment knowing that he had made a difference. Sarah often teased him about becoming a professional activist, but she couldn't hide her admiration. One evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset, she leaned her head against his shoulder. "You've done so much good," she said softly. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if you hadn't spoken up?" John thought for a moment before answering. "Yeah, I do sometimes," he admitted. "And honestly, it scares me to think about where we'd be if no one had said anything. But I guess that's why it's so important to remind ourselves that standing up isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about showing others that they're not alone." Her smile widened as she squeezed his hand. "Well, you've definitely done that. You've shown everyone what's possible when we stick together." The years rolled on, bringing new challenges and opportunities. The town continued to evolve, growing stronger and more united with each passing day. Children who had grown up hearing stories about John's bravery carried those lessons into adulthood, using them to guide their own decisions. Law enforcement agencies nationwide looked to the town as a model for reform, studying its successes and learning from its struggles. And through it all, John remained a steadfast presence, quietly leading by example, always ready to lend a hand or offer advice. Looking back, John realized that his journey had taught him more than he ever imagined. It had shown him the power of resilience, the strength of community, and the importance of holding fast to one's principles, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Most importantly, it had reminded him that change was possible. Not overnight and not without sacrifice, but possible nonetheless. On a crisp autumn morning, John stood outside the newly renovated police station, surrounded by friends, family, and neighbors. The building bore a plaque commemorating the reforms that had taken place, along with a dedication to those who dared to speak up. As he gazed at the inscription, John felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest. This wasn't just a monument to his efforts, it was a testament to the collective strength of a community that refused to stay silent. Turning to the crowd, he raised his hand in gratitude, his heart full. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "None of this would have been possible without all of you." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the streets like a promise that no matter how dark things might seem, hope and justice would always prevail. For John, it was the perfect ending to a story that had begun with fear and uncertainty but ended with triumph and transformation.